Hi, folks, and welcome to another conversation where we get to explore what is the soul of the United States, how do we shape it, care for it, and get to meet some people from across disciplines who do it in a very unique way. So today I'm very excited because my minister at the Unitarian Universalist Church, the Mount Diablo Unitarian Universalist Church in Walnut Creek, um, I've developed a special fondness for, not just because she is our minister, but when I first started visiting, I don't know, 18 months ago, something like that, I found myself moved to tears um, by her sermons, by the sermons of the associate ministers. And I was like, there's something special here. This is different than other UUs, which I've been to, San Francisco, Sacramento, Davis. And so with that, I want to say just a couple other things about who Reverend Leslie is for our community. Meaning, like she is the shepherd, she is holding it together, developing, mentoring, holding ritual, performing ceremony at all the life stages. So she's seen just about everything in terms of what can happen in a human life and in a community as well tended as our community. But she also has got her eye on the future and is looking at systemic change within the Unitarian Universalist Association of Churches, um, and her curiosities around, especially trauma in this day and age. Which I'm like, yes, this is exactly what the world needs, what America needs, what our community needs. So, with that, welcome, Reverend Leslie.
Thank you, Brandon. I'm honored to be here and grateful for your work.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I couldn't do it without the Sunday and the Wednesday inspiration and connection that you and your colleagues provide for us. It's really I know I speak on behalf of the entire congregation. Thank you. Um,
Thank you. Thank you.
so to begin this discussion, I would just love for some thoughts on your journey to this work, because there are
Mhm.
you have so many talents that could be applied in all sorts of helpful ways. What what was your journey here? How did you know, like, yes, this is how I am going to devote the best years of my life? Like, what was your journey into this faith and into ministry?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I began by wanting to be a journalist, and I started as a journalist and was in community journalism, which was dying at the time, and I was doing writing 13 articles a week and doing all the darkroom work every Monday night all night, and was really empowered by it. But one of my beats was the government beat, and I started to think, I'd sort of rather be on that side of the table, not this side writing it down. I'd like to be, thinking about the problems and trying to solve them. So I went back to get a degree in public policy and environmental policy, and then got involved with that work and got to meet amazing people and go through communities throughout the southeast of the US, which is, in its own way, very much a third world nation in its own way, and really get to talk to a lot of people, from some of the wealthiest people at the time in that region to some of the poorest. And it was an amazing journey. And at the same time, I had discovered Unitarian Universalism, which the Unitarian part was part of my heritage, actually on my mother's side, but we had not been brought up in it. So in my 20s, connected with it, and I began to see that while we have lots of ways to solve things, the part of the solution that most intrigued me was the spiritual part, the part about answering those unanswerable questions. I'm a person that's always lived sort of in the interstitial tissue of the world, right? So in between things, multiracial, I'm even in Generation Jones, which is these couple years between the boomers and Gen X, that's kind of like this mushy area. Just my whole life has been like that. So I was like, I really like that. I like that weird ethereal stuff that also has practical application. So eventually I just worked my way into doing this as my calling. And it took me a long time, but I finally answered the call and went back to become a minister, is what I do in the daytime as well as the evening. So it's been an important piece of work. Yeah.
Wow. I love just that there's like the same spirit, same intention. Well, like let's see if I can make
Right.
a difference here in journalism. Let's see if
Exactly.
we're here in policy,
Yep.
and then because I mean I've had a similar. like wildly different circumstances, but like same progression is like,
Right.
oh, it's like the way through is down and in, and it's together, and it's
Absolutely.
because
There's
I
that
mean,
wonderful story that the Quaker teacher and theologian Parker Palmer tells, right, about being on an outward bound trip and he's hanging off the side of the cliff and he gets that paralysis that you get when you're hanging off the side of large objects. And which I discovered at one point in my life, but he looks up at the guide and the guide says the only way out is back, is through, down. And so he did it, and that's kind of that piece as well. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So that brings us to this question of like, well, what is that, this substrate, this liminality,
Yeah.
this between thing that we can't necessarily see with our naked eye, but it seems like it informs just about everything. And so I'm curious, like, as you courted the Unitarian Universalist like purpose, their values, the spirit, like how do you understand it, and how do you see it as like dancing with that of the broader nation?
Right. Well, I will say that my particular chosen path has been Unitarian Universalism, one of my paths, right? I'm also informed by others like Buddhism and actually, um the natural um the rhythms of the natural world, right? Being someone who's I'm drawn to the rhythms of the natural world in the way that my Japanese ancestors interpret it through Shintoism. They're just all these different ways that so I say that because I am the world's biggest cheerleader for my particular faith tradition. But what I'm really a cheerleader for is engagement with a tradition and engagement with the various ways of knowing, whether they're the formal ways that we have or the ways that we learn by just, being out in the world with that kind of attention. And I think the reason that I am is because we live in a world that really wants us to have instant solutions, simple answers, one line taglines, and we don't live in that world. Like that's not the world we really live in, right? And my very jumbled, odd assortment of resume items that made sense to no one but me landed me exactly where I am because it was a little bit of each piece as I was trying to figure out, these questions about, what does it mean to be a human being? Can we best approach that? And then how can we enter into it with vulnerability and the willingness to embrace paradox. And I honestly think right now that those might be two of the most important skills that we have in the world, right? The ability to allow our hearts to be broken open by the world, which could happen to us dozens of times in any given day, right? Just this day and or just this week, the things that have happened. The willingness to have some kind of container around us that allows us not to have to just push it all away, because we're sort of trained to do that too, right? I
Yeah,
think that's a really important piece. And then to be able to hold different truths in tension as opposed to trying to find that one, you know, magic formula. Because I don't think we have that. I think we're gonna just, tease it out in conversations like this one, just keep talking to each other, just keep being in relationship with each other. I think that's the way we're gonna get to that path.
yeah. And that I think that is one of the kind of the distinguishing elements of like a UU
It is, yes.
community
Because
faith
we're
is like,
non-creedal. We're non-creedal.
yeah,
And so we're not saying there's the one path. I mean, you're right. And in some ways, that is very true about our
yeah,
particular path. But what I will say, having known very devoted Lutherans and Methodists and Catholics where there is a creedal aspect of it, I've known many people who um, have found their own way of interpreting that creed and still living a life of great vulnerability and engagement and complexity in that as well. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think for so long the nation was kind of held together by that. People were attached to these various creeds, but they found their own way into it, and that created a lot of strength within these faith communities, but also in the broader community and between the faith communities. Um, and as you and I both know, as most folks know, that membership has gone down in lots of places. I mean, we're
right.
very lucky; ours is thriving, but so many are not. Um, and we're seeing some of the results over the last few decades that just trust, cohesion, all that stuff has gone away. Um, and so I'm curious, like you think about faith communities and you in specific, like what is our role in how to bring us back into what it means to be an American, like the purpose of the United States, like how do we treat each other with the respect
Absolutely.
that our
Yeah. I love that question because I often say when I talk to people that are new to our community, the interesting thing about our faith traditions and Unitarian Universalism, which is a really ungainly name, is because we weren't willing to give up either of the two names of the faith traditions that merged in 1961 and became the Unitarian Universalist Association. But both of them, what they held in common was that the people who came over in the days of white colonial settlement came over from England predominantly because they were looking for religious freedom. And they had these two traditions, one which said truth can be found in lots of different sources, not just, there's only one truth, God, truth, and it's going to be interpreted through lots of sources. And then we had the other truth that said every person has value, no one is damned forever. And those two traditions came over here. They're both considered very dangerous because they challenged the authority of the formal church. And they came over here seeking liberty. And the forms of governance that we have in this nation were informed by some of those ideas that were, the ideas that some of the founders of this nation were very influenced by, Jefferson and Franklin and Adams, the second president, was actually a Unitarian. So they're entangled in our democracy. And so sometimes I think, you know, wouldn't it be great if we could get back into that democratic experimentation again and think about how do we operate in a democratic society where we have we're a collection of minority collective, right? It's a very different model. It's a very different model. And I think there's lots of ways that we're actually seeing that experimentation in our faith now, which isn't comfortable for everybody.
Mhm.
But it is potentially really exciting as well, you know?
Yeah.
Mhm.
I love that you have that. It almost feels like entrepreneurial flair. Like nothing is set in stone about our tradition or all the other traditions. They've all evolved. They've all moved with the times. And you know, now we have a clear imperative, all hands on deck. Like the very structure, economic, political structure of the nation and the health of the human species on this planet require all of us to do our part. And the spirit layer, I think, is the part that like gets the least amount of attention
Mhm.
and is potentially the one that has the most transformative power. And I think so few folks are aware of that like that there is a civic faith, and it overlaps with a lot of faith traditions, including UU tradition.
Yeah.
Um,
And if
I
I
was,
could say one thing about that, Brandon, like, what I appreciate about that is so I worked in rural economic development in my first job out of grad school as public policy wonk, right? So, but we were really doing experimentations. We were working with some of the foundations in the Southeast, and they were looking at ways we could have alternatives to big factory development in town. So we'd go to these different towns. And what was so interesting was that this was when there was a lot of consolidation in banking, right? So the
Mhm.
banks were becoming these global banks, international banks. And so what was happening in all these little towns was the banks were getting pulled out of all these tiny little rural communities. And went with that was the civic infrastructure, actually, right? Because the banker used to be the head of this, that, and the other thing, and
Yeah.
provided a certain amount of stability. So people didn't realize when we started to get international banking that we would also lose the leadership, some of the leadership of our small towns and and I say that because I think the same thing is happening now with the loss of our faith communities. And,
Mhm.
there is a lot of damage. I want to be the first to say there's been a lot of damage through institutional religion. It has done a lot of harm in the biggest sense and the smallest sense to the individuals. I talk to a lot of those folks because many of them find their way to us as an alternative. But that said, I don't think we're going to be better as a nation with less with fewer faith community, because I think in the same way that the banks provided that structure to those little towns, our faith communities provided some values which were terrible, heinous, hateful, targeting certain groups or targeting certain people or, sexual identities or, all of that. That was really is really destructive. Yet they also did teach values around service and community that I think without that we lose, and now people will say, I'd prefer to get my spirituality through an app. And and this is one thing I'm not that flexible about. You were talking about flexibility and
Yeah.
entrepreneurship, right? I'm not that flexible
Mhm.
about that because I honestly think I use those apps, right? I think they're great, but I don't think they're enough. And I think we still need those values around community and service and because they help us recognize in a real tangible way our interdependence.
Mhm.
Without that, we can believe that we can actually exist in these bubbles, and I don't think we can
Yeah.
truly thrive in these bubbles. So that is one thing I'm a little creedal about. So I thought I'd just throw that out there before we go on.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I think that that speaks to, um, this concurrent hyper individualism,
Yes,
this kind of market imperialism type stuff that has deluded us into thinking that like are, solitary human beings, and that our salvation lies through the acquisition of things or status or partners and children versus like a more centered orientation, like where our primary unit of human is the community, and ourself as is an expression of that as our family units and all that. So it's almost like this perfect storm where like religion and spirituality have been like atomized, commodified, appified, and
everything. Everything has been, and if you couple that with the individualization of it and the commodification of it with the fear mongering and the othering,
Mhm.
which creates a fear of being with other people. The fact that, again, this is where I think vulnerability becomes a really important spiritual skill, right? Because when you're in community, yes, something's going to be messy. Someone is going to, I mean, it could be literally messy, but but a baby might do something really messy in front of you, or even an elder, something could happen. But it's important that, you're in that community. It's a real relationship. It is more of a risk to come to a small service and be vulnerable speaking in a circle of people than it is to sit and listen to a highly, cultivated performance on an app. But there is something that happens that's it's irreplaceable, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
I'm going to introduce a brief commercial advertisement or non-commercial advertisement for our congregation for a second, because um, the thoughts and words and ideas that are in the sermons, that are in the songs that have been written by ministers and philosophers, that's freely available.
Right.
But the gathering and the sewing together of those things with the sharing, shoulder to shoulder with people in community, that's irreplaceable. So like I said, like when I first came to our community, like I was like probably like every third or fourth sermon I was bawling because I was like everything came together and the words started to mean something because they were together in community. Like my heart was like,
Right.
and my voice were part of it. I was hearing it, I was feeling it. Um and I know other folks in other traditions have that too. And that I've not seen replicated in just an app or just listening to a powerful, Martin Luther King speech or something. Like I actually need the other people there too. Um, and I think folks are starting to get that, loneliness, isolation epidemics, and all that. And yeah, we've been trained for 5 years or so in the pandemic to to further isolate,
Right.
um, and now we're like all trying to like kind of claw our way back into like, hey, friend,
Yes,
I'm a
exactly.
human being. Let's be that human
Yeah,
being
I'm going to
together.
take a risk and you're going to say something awkward and I'm going to be like, "Oh, what am I supposed to say to that?" But it's going to be okay. We're going to figure it out, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's an important thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, especially and I think about the beauty of like Christian faith or
Mhm.
Muslim faith, that they're so multiracial. and like us as a nation that aspires to all created equal and e pluribus unum, and seeing the divinity in one another, like faith communities are essentially like pro democracy organizations when done well, and they can also have anti democratic expressions too. But like, yeah, it's a huge opportunity for us to.
And that's something where, in our particular tradition that is been really important to me. I think about this sometimes. I almost always go to worship somewhere. So if I'm off, I'll go somewhere else. If I'm traveling, I'll go somewhere. I just like to drop in. It doesn't matter in a way to me. I love to see that. But as far as being at home, why I do appreciate our tradition is that we have this radically democratic polity, right? Our highest authority is the individual vote of our congregation, and our structures are built upon that as the atom, right? It doesn't come top down, it goes bottom up. But the reason why I think that's important is because it recognizes that real truth, which is that we need every person's gifts, that every person's gifts are very important. And we see that through the ways that we're organized. And I think that, and that allows us to experiment with things, and one of the things we have been experimenting with is inclusion and trying to put people together that have not been honored in traditional sanctuaries across this nations and other nations. And I think that makes it really important. And that's been a big part of my work in our association at the national level, has been to what we call widen the circle, right? Broaden the dialogue and make sure that we embrace that. I think there's vulnerability in that. There's a lot of messiness in that. There is no simple answer. The simple answer isn't just replace this person with this person. The answer isn't just use this source and this source. It's that dialogue. It's like, how do we add that voice into the dialogue? Because that's what we've been missing, is the
Yeah.
interplay. And that is trickier because we have bias, we have prejudice, we have all these things that make it harder for us to hear one another. And we have populations that have lived with huge amounts of trauma in our society because of the structure of our society, and the in a world where everybody at some point now has some feeling of having been traumatized, we can get into a lot of mess with each other, as we're seeing, across our nation and we see every day. That's part of the heartbreak we greet, you
Yeah.
know, in our
Yeah.
morning news apps. So, yeah.
Yeah. And it
Mhm.
goes back to that old kind of like marital thing. It's like never about the toothpaste cap. Like there's a deeper wound
Right.
and want and need that's underneath that. And even though in our community, lots of smarty pants people who like read a lot and accredited and all that kind of stuff. And if you grew up in the United States anytime within the last 100 years, you received some trauma, even if you come from a background of extreme privilege like I did. Like
Mhm.
it's still there.
Right.
And so now we're going to get into like the real kind of third rail of this
Yes,
conversation, I think,
absolutely.
is
Yeah.
like
Hmm.
trauma,
Yeah.
spiritual growth.
Hmm.
They aren't frequently used in the same sentence or conversation. Um, and your experience of trauma, my experience of trauma, I, we both understand that they're fairly interrelated. And I'm curious if you could say a little bit about how you see trauma work and spiritual communities kind of converging or co-evolving together, because there could be lots of possibility in the center there.
I think there is a lot of possibility, and I think it's almost an essential set of skills now for spiritual communities to be. And in fact, I think this is the next phase of my work in the world, honestly, is to begin to continue to amass the resources around this. And there's lots of people doing this now, more people anyway than used to be doing it. Certainly people are doing it. But I'm really interested in this because I think that even in communities like ours that have an intentionality around welcoming and an intentionality around inclusion, so many of the ways that we do things exclude people that have traumatic experience, which is a lot of folks, and I'll just say for my own self, having grown up multiracial and being born in a time when that was still actually, multiracial families were still illegal in the nation, right? Because the Supreme Court hadn't ruled that they weren't,
Mhm.
which happened a few years after I was born. Um, and being on in being a person who, because I could sometimes pass for being white, sometimes not. I walked in different circles all the time. I would always see those divisions. I think that's one of the reasons that I really like to linger on those edges, because I see the pain of those divisions and the incredible pain of that. And being the daughter of somebody who was interned interned as a Japanese American in Poston relocation camp in Arizona, and as a preschool kid, and had that shape his life and then shape my life, et cetera, et cetera. I think what we really have to have our communities understand the multi-generational nature of trauma, but also the ways in which how we do things traditionally can actually make people feel so frightened that they aren't going to participate. And what's interesting about our traumatic experience in this country is that we aren't we aren't encouraged to be vulnerable. So when we start to feel those feelings of vulnerability, some little alarm in our head, some survival mechanism says, run away from that. It's not okay. And as we do that, we run away from the things we need the most to heal and to find that wholeness, right? Which is already within us, but which sometimes we're too afraid to venture into. And I think that um, we have the ability to read right now, religious institutions in the United States and actually across the world in the European tradition are either vanishing or they're endangered. And so that gives them a chance to reinvent themselves fully and do something different. And I think that we have the ability to be the kind of places where we allow people to grow in their vulnerability, to allow people to grow in their self-exploration. We're living in a world, an age with amazing new tools and just technologies around how we
Mhm.
um, process the trauma we discover. But the problem for a lot of people is being willing to get near that discovery
Yeah.
and to understand that when I'm around you and something you do makes me feel defensive, some of that might be you, but some of
Mhm.
that might be me. And how do we have the depth of relationships where we can have that dialogue and really understand that? And I know that one of the things you do is work with men's groups, and I really appreciate that because I really worry especially about that kind of toxic masculinity that I think is endangering our men and especially our young men. And I have two young grandchildren now, 3 and 1, and I'm really interested in when my daughter, their mother was young, we were buying all the books, I was buying her all the books on girl empowerment and girls are great. But I actually almost feel now we need resources that say to little male identified kids, you're great, you have power, there are good things about you. And it's actually hard to find those. I've actually been looking. But it's
Well, I
because
mean, they exist in the toxic manosphere, but they like the actual like whole sovereign like
right.
blessing like
Yeah,
that male um energy like resource books all that stuff about how great it is to be a little boy. I mean,
right.
it's like
Where are those books? Brandon, you need to write those books. It's like, because, really, like, we need to, because that would be the thing that would make it possible for people not to grow up thinking they have to be that
Mhm,
invulnerable, impenetrable person, right? And that is the um antithesis to what you need to heal and
mhm,
to claim the wholeness you already have within you, right?
yeah. Well, like, I think about the the more intimate gatherings within UUs, like the community circles. I know there's we have a burgeoning men's connection circle, and the availability of transformation technologies. Like, you know, I'm not saying we should do this, but like it is available. We have regression and Gestalt work. We
Right.
have EMDR. We have lots of things available for us to heal as a community. We got Thomas Hubel's collective trauma integration process. We got all sorts of things that are here. And what all of us who are traumatized, and especially like young boys, as they look up to try to say, like, what kind of man do I want to be? We can eventually have healed whole men for them to look up to. Um, and yeah, I think about that a lot. My girlfriend, I guess you call it, lady friend, woman I love, she has a 15-year-old son, and
Oh,
he's a
wow.
beautiful son, or beautiful man, young man in a lot of ways. And I see, um, just how this kind of the external influences come into his life. And I was like, and there's nobody there to, from a male perspective, to help him work this through. He's got a great mom, but at some point, it can't just all come from mom, or it's going to be all all things like caring and emotional are going to be relegated as female. And so he needs
That's
to have
right.
that
That's
coming
right.
from, you know,
Right.
men in his life. So,
That's right. I mean, this is a great example too about our interdependence, right? Because
yeah,
it's not just about the need for this, we need this throughout all society and people of all genders, right? The non-binary people as well need this. It's like we have to be able to see models in whoever we are, that reflect that kind of integrity and joy that
mm,
we know we have within us. And this is where the othering, the ways that we're being taught, and it is happening through, our toxic kind of
mm,
capitalism that or the hyper capitalism that we're in right now. It is We're commodifying some of these things and we're assigning them to people and not allowing people to have their wholeness. So it really harms everything. We used to say, I did a lot of work, racial justice work, and we would talk about racism does not just harm the people that it targets. That's
yeah,
true of all oppressions. Oppressions
yeah,
harm the oppressor as well, right? And this is such a great example of that.
yeah.
Yeah.
So we got our work cut out for us, Reverend Leslie.
Yes, we do. We do. We do.
Um,
Yeah.
I want to dig more into the trauma and spiritual life piece.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, as you've been writing about it, thinking about it, like, what do you see as like things we can do next to take our next step on the journey of being more healed and whole and in community together?
So one thing I'd love to see is I'd love to see congregations be like the portal, the first step to talking about the fact that people have traumatic experience, and that it's okay to explore it, and but in ways that makes sense today. And I think one of the things that more contemporary research, psychological research, has told us is that we used to think that the way to do this was you had to just talk about it. And if you talked about it, it was going to, well, now they're actually finding that's not the way necessarily especially with certain kinds of traumatic experience. But what is important is that you be in a place where you feel cared and held and care, and embraced in it. So if we could be that place, then maybe I don't think this is, solely our work, but I think we could be a gateway to it, like the portal, like I said, because I've watched this time and time again that people that were not willing to get, for example, the psychological help they needed, were willing to do it when they had a community
Mhm.
that they knew would be with them when they did that, or even a couple friends. That's a community, right? That they really trusted and that they could call when things got hard, with the amazing advances that are happening. I think that, being able to be a place for a kid that's gone through something that they
Yeah.
really need to be able to talk to somebody, to be able to be a place for, somebody that has been through a really difficult relationship and they need to heal from it, a relationship that might have been psychologically damaging or manipulative, or controlling. There are so many places where I think we could be that portal. So educating ourselves about it and seeing our knowledge, like I think in my day we've watched our communities learn how to be better to people of color, to be better to our LGBTQI siblings. But this is another area, like we could be, trauma embracing, not just informed but embracing, inclusive. And I think there are some very specific ways we can do that. One of them I will say in general is just that when you've had a life where especially so many forms of trauma involve the loss of rights and choice, you've been constricted, So
Mhm.
just giving people choices, you can say, you can come do it this way, or you can come do it that way. You can come, and we did it during, as we were coming out of COVID, you can come back into the sanctuary, or you can be on our patio, or it's
Mhm.
still true, right? And you can be online, and that's okay. Um, but giving people choices about their path and not prescribing one path. And that is where sometimes I think the more creedal um, faiths can be damaging to people who have trauma, right? Because they say you've got to go through it this way. And this is true also with the other with recovery, right? Because addiction has become a huge
Mhm.
issue
Mhm.
in our society. And so these paths that for some people are really helpful because it's like the structure they need. For other people, it's who have deep trauma, the idea that there's only one way you can become sober or one way you can, get clean is not helpful to them. So having these different choices, I think, is really, really important.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think that's a big piece of it is to get away from this idea that there's the one right answer. And I will say, communities that are deeply rooted in the intellect and in science, for a long time, I think we thought science
Mhm.
meant we're going to find the one right answer. I think now what we see is science is more like art. We find this splash of theory and that splash, and they're all useful, but there's not one answer. And doctors will tell you that medicine is an art. We certainly learned that in these last years, right? We don't have the perfect answers for things that happen medically, right? And so you only have to have someone you love go through a terrible illness to know that there aren't the answers you'd want. So I think that if we could embrace this ethic of being curious and being learners and being deeply empathetic with each other,
Yeah.
seeing ourselves as just travelers together on a journey.
Mm.
And that's a lot of it, not being worried about whether my vulnerability makes me less than you or your vulnerability makes you less than me, but just being able to be in that together. That would be a huge piece of it. And community can teach us that. There's very few other
Mm.
things that can teach us that.
Yeah. I mean, I I'm excited because the with one of the things I've experienced in our men's connection circle is like we had like really powerful um, you know moments, and it's obviously confidential. I'm not going to share what
No, no,
happened,
no. Right,
but like
right.
um, the possibility of being in a community that has a transformative element,
Yeah,
a collective transformative element, and is also dancing with the great beyond. And you know, obviously we've got our own way, but lots of other folks have another way to doing it. Like where I don't have to take this part of myself or this area of my life around healing or transformation or growth and have it be separate from this part that is about community and spirituality. And like why shouldn't they be the same? Because
mhm.
my wounds inhibit me from connecting with others. They inhibit me from experiencing the divine. It sounds like it's part of the value proposition. It just hasn't been named and developed.
Right, right.
You know?
Exactly. Right.
So it's exciting. I'm
I mean,
excited
it's
for
like
you.
if you were a manager and you weren't good at organizing, you'd go out and take a
Yeah.
course to learn how to organize, right? So if if you're a person and you've had experience that made it hard for you to trust people or, then being in a community is a great way to learn and then finding those couple people that you can say, well, that was really hard for me, you know.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to psych myself up to do that again, but I did it.
Yeah. Amen.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as we move to a close, I've a
Mhm.
couple final questions for you.
Sure.
One is, if let's say your legacy, like you can name it. Like when I get planted, when I take my last breath, I want to have had made like this one singular impact on American spiritual life. Like, what would that be?
I think that it would be to have helped people understand the incredible value in diversity of experience. Not just identity, although identity is a diversity of experience, but but just diversity of experience, that we could learn as much as we do here from the person who is, you know, mentally ill and living in their car than from the greatest, most eloquent speaker that we could possibly have. And I do believe that's true. And that's been how my life has revealed itself to me. So I think that would be it.
Yeah. I'm just kind of musing on that Fred Rogers quote, like everything is either love or request for love, or I get expression of love or request for love. Like,
Mhm,
and I
mhm.
think about, when I'm on my e-bike, like cursing at SUVs, and I'm like, oh well, come on, man. Like they're showing love and they're requesting love, and they're or walking down Walnut Creek and seeing fashion and plastic surgery, and I'm like, "Whew, just a request for love, just a request for love."
Right, 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 right.
Um, so you're obviously born here and experienced America in that what you call the Jones generation.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Generation Jones. We're the
Generation
little group.
Jones. Um, and I'm curious because you've had so many different experiences and touch points with civic life, with what it means to be an American. Like, was there a moment that you're like, oh, this is what this place is about, or like you actually like felt it in your bones, like, that's what this thing is they keep talking about, or that's why we're here. Is there a moment where you kind of felt that?
Probably a number of them, but one that comes to mind for me, and it has to do with experimentation, is during the pandemic, we were supporting some people that were unhoused.
Mhm.
And we were doing, because one of the things that people didn't realize is all of a sudden people didn't have access to water, that they would go into public places. Those places were all closed. They didn't have access to food. They didn't have access to things. And so we were doing some of that. And um, I think that was also the time, as you remember, there was the racial uprising that happened across the nation. And so there was this big student-led protest in Walnut Creek. I don't know if you were here that at that time, but it was actually immense for Walnut Creek, which is a small city. And there was a huge mobilization of law enforcement. So there was literally a wall. There were several walls of law enforcement, all in riot gear, with this student-led protest. And I remember walking through that. There were two things that happened that made me really think this is the mess that's democracy, but it's really important. And it was that these kids in Walnut Creek had gotten this idea that they wanted to do this thing and they had made this thing happen. And just hundreds and hundreds of people had actually turned out, and they were walking over the bridges through this very frightening scene, which later did turn violent. But just the fact that they were willing to do that, I think, was really important, and it showed the importance, the ability to move. And I had had a similar experience before at the first women's march, because I had always thought it Walnut Creek, since I've lived here, has been more of a shopping center than anything else. It's kind of like a big outdoor mall. And all of a sudden we were walking through the streets, it was wall to wall, building to building people. And I saw the city in a completely different way. It was like, this is a really different city. So I'd already had that experience. But in the middle of all that, I got a call from a man who lives in his car, still does. And he said to me, Reverend, I'm going to tell you this. I got people and they know the things that are happening, and it's going to get ugly out there in a little bit, and you need to get your people out. And I
Mm,
said, okay. And so we quietly, we said, because there was like a choice to kind of go on or not, and people were following. And so we started to move some of our people out. And it got ugly after that. And the fact that this person who, we could think of it as a top-down thing. We're helping them, giving them food and water. They, this person believed we were their community, and they're like, uh-oh, I've got information I'm going to help my community. And they did. and they might have saved some people from getting really seriously injured. So it was a really amazing moment of, I mean, it was in the framework of violence, which is not my favorite part of what's happening in our world, but it was a great illustration, I think, of interdependence in this very typical middle class city that's not, it's not a big uh,
Hmm. Yeah.
cosmopolitan setting, just an average thing that happens
Hmm.
and very, very mundane. But I think it shows the possibility we have when we treat one another as full human beings, and when we actually can see the value in people that this is a person who has a formerly incarcerated, person of color, totally impoverished, not much literacy actually, even though an adult. And because we were able to see his humanity, he was keeping ours in mind and took the time to call and make that call and let us know. So to
Wow.
me, that is the moment that um, captures for me at this moment what our nation could be, and hopefully in more peaceful times at some point again too.
Yeah. Wow. Beautiful. And I know that everyone, whether listening to this or watching this or not, has got some moment like that. Like, that's what this place is about. And um, I'm always curious what that moment is for folks. Because it's very rarely like, oh, I was doing the Pledge of Allegiance in school, or I cast my vote for so and so. It's like, no, it was like when somebody who I don't have any blood ties with did something that made me feel seen, valued, acknowledged, cared for. Um, and so, yeah, uh,
We are a union, right? We're
we
supposed to
are.
be a union, and this is like a moment of union. And I think that's what's so important for us to, in this time of incredible divisiveness, if we can hold on to those moments. And I appreciate your work in helping us find them. And
Well, thank you. Thank you. So, for folks who want to continue this conversation more, we could say, yeah, come visit us at MDUC. But like,
absolutely.
what do you want them to? Because this likely could be a national, international
Yeah.
viewership. Like, what do you want them to do?
Yeah, there's a couple different things. So thank you for that. I mean, I would invite them to consider again the possibility of um, looking for a faith community, one that you would commit to for just a little while, commit for a month, commit for a year, whatever. Just try it on. I would really invite people to do that. And then as far as the work around trauma and faith, which I think is really important if there are people who are already in a community, but they're interested in how to advance that. I am actually going to launch, it should have happened this summer, but it didn't quite happen, a website based on that, called, yeah, so I'm working on that website and so if you Google me at some point, in the next month or so, that will be, the stub of it is up, but it's going to have resources on how to do that. And also some liturgical resources, just some poetries and meditations and reflections for us as we hold trauma in this world, as we try to hold trauma and faith, that paradox, right, of trauma and faith together.
Awesome.
So those are things that I would recommend. So
That's so cool. I will, of course, be sharing that out across my networks. Do you want to share the URL now, even though it might not be ready? Just so
um,
it will exist in the
can we
future.
put it in the, can
Show
we link it
notes?
to the video? Can we put it in the comments? Yeah, I'll send
Yeah.
it to you. Yeah, that
Okay.
would be great.
Great. Well, thank you, Reverend Leslie. I will see you tonight at Vespers. So
Great. That'll be great, Brandon. I'll look forward to it. Thank you so much for what you're doing.
you got it. You got it. And yeah, this is obviously the just the latest of our string of conversations. So
Good.
I'll see you
That'll be
soon.
great. Thank you, Brandon. Bye.